The Vampire King's autistic son arranged his candy purchase in perfect color order, and the cashier lady quietly matched his pattern with the receipt and change. His delighted giggle echoed through the empty store. What no one realized, his father had been standing in the shadows for decades, waiting for this exact moment. Maya Chen's shift began at 11 p.m., the exact moment when the university district transformed from chaos to predictable quiet. She counted the fluorescent lights as they hummed their electric lullaby, 27 tubes casting harsh white over aisles of precisely arranged merchandise. The coffee machine gurgled on a 7-minute cycle. The security camera in aisle 3 clicked counterclockwise every 43 seconds. These patterns comforted her in ways other people found strange. But Maya had long stopped trying to explain why counting and organizing calmed the constant buzz in her mind. At Sullivan's Corner Market, she was the night guardian of order, ensuring every product faced forward, every price tag aligned, every surface wiped to the same spotless standard. The pay was terrible, but the solitude was priceless. Most customers who stumbled in after midnight were drunk college students grabbing energy drinks or chips, their movements erratic and unpredictable. Maya handled them efficiently, scanning items while maintaining minimal eye contact, her well-practiced routine protecting her from overstimulation. But at 2:47 a.m. every Tuesday, something different happened. The automatic door chimed its electronic greeting, and the pale teenager entered like clockwork. Maya had started calling him Rainbow in her mind, though she'd never spoken to him beyond the required cashier pleasantries. He moved through the store with purpose, his path never varying. 7 steps to aisle 2, pause at the candy display, methodical selection process that took exactly 4 minutes and 30 seconds. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. Tonight marked his 13th visit since Maya started tracking his pattern in her notebook. She watched from behind the counter as Rainbow approached the candy rack, his movements fluid and deliberate. Red Swedish fish first, picked up and examined under the light before placement in his small basket. Orange gummies next. The bag turned so the ingredient label faced outward. Yellow lemon drops, green sour strips, blue rock candy, indigo jawbreakers, violet gum. Each selection made with the same careful consideration, each item positioned in his basket, according to some internal logic Maya recognized but couldn't fully understand. When Rainbow approached her counter, Maya felt the familiar flutter of social anxiety mixed with genuine curiosity. He never spoke beyond necessary transaction words, but she'd noticed things about him that others missed. The way he flinched slightly when the fluorescent lights buzzed too loudly. How he avoided touching the metal door handles, using his sleeve instead. The careful distance he maintained from other customers, positioning himself to avoid unexpected contact. These behaviors felt familiar to Maya, like recognizing kindred spirit in someone who navigated the world differently. Rainbow placed his 7 candy pieces on the counter in perfect chromatic order, just as he always did. Red Swedish fish on the far left, violet gum on the far right, each subsequent color flowing into the next like a edible rainbow. Maya's hands moved without conscious thought as she rang up each item, but tonight something shifted in her awareness. Instead of simply bagging the candy in random order, she found herself arranging the receipt, change, and small paper bag to mirror his color pattern. The receipt went to the left like the red candy, coins in the middle matching the yellow and green placement, the bag positioned on the right where the violet gum had been. It wasn't planned or deliberate. Her neurodivergent mind simply recognized the beauty in his system and responded in kind, creating order where chaos usually reigned. When Rainbow looked down at the counter and saw her arrangement, his entire posture changed. His eyes, which Maya now noticed were an unusual pale gray, widened in what looked like genuine surprise. For a moment he stared at her pattern, then back at her face, something shifting in his expression that Maya had never seen before. Then it happened. A sound escaped him that was pure joy, a delighted giggle that seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised Maya. The laugh transformed his entire face, erasing the careful neutrality he usually wore and replacing it with something radiant and alive. Maya felt her own face breaking into an involuntary smile, warmth spreading through her chest at having somehow made this connection with another person. The moment stretched between them, fragile and perfect, until Rainbow carefully gathered his items and coins, his movements slower than usual, as if he didn't want to break whatever had just been created. He walked toward the door with his same measured pace, but just before the automatic sensor triggered, he turned back and gave Maya the smallest nod of acknowledgement before disappearing into the night. Maya stood behind the counter for several minutes after he left, staring at the space where he'd been and trying to process what had just occurred. In her 26 years, she'd had few moments of genuine human connection that didn't feel forced or performative. Most social interactions required her to mask her true nature, to pretend that small talk felt natural and eye contact didn't make her skin crawl. But with Rainbow, something different had happened. She'd acted from pure instinct, responding to his patterns with her own understanding of order and comfort, and somehow they'd found each other across the vast space that usually separated her from other people. Outside in the university district, sodium streetlights cast amber pools along empty sidewalks, while shadows gathered in doorways and between parked cars. What Maya couldn't see was the figure standing motionless in the darkness between two streetlights, positioned at an angle that gave him perfect sightlines into the convenience store. Damien Ashworth had perfected the art of invisibility over centuries of existence, his vampire nature allowing him to blend with shadows in ways that defied human perception. For 37 years, he had followed his son Elijah's nighttime wanderings, always maintaining enough distance to avoid detection while ensuring his protection. The convenience store had become part of Elijah's routine 3 months ago, one of the few places where he seemed to find some measure of peace in a world that constantly overwhelmed his sensitive nature. Damien had watched every interaction between Elijah and the young woman behind the counter, noting how she seemed to understand things about his son that others missed. The way she dimmed the harsh fluorescent light slightly when Elijah entered, though she probably thought no one noticed. How she kept the area around the candy display cleaner and more organized than the rest of the store. Small accommodations that spoke to an intuitive understanding of what Elijah needed to feel safe. But tonight, Damien had witnessed something that shook him to his ancient core. For 300 years, his son had been locked in silence, unable to connect with others in meaningful ways that brought him joy. Autism wasn't a condition that vampire society understood or accommodated. Most of the royal court saw Elijah's differences as weaknesses that made him unfit to inherit the throne, and Damien had spent decades fighting political battles to protect his son's position as heir. The sound of Elijah's laughter carried across the empty street like music Damien hadn't heard in centuries. That genuine expression of delight was worth more than all the gold in his treasury, more precious than the crown he wore or the power he wielded. In that moment, watching his son connect with another soul, Damien felt something stir in his chest that he'd thought permanently extinguished by the weight of immortality and responsibility. Hope was a dangerous thing for a vampire king to feel, especially when it centered around a mortal woman working the night shift at a convenience store. But as Damien watched Elijah walk away from Sullivan's Corner Market with something approaching lightness in his step, he allowed himself to believe that perhaps his son's future held more possibility than anyone had dared imagine. The implications of what he'd witnessed would require careful consideration. In vampire society, connections between royalty and mortals were fraught with political complications and ancient laws that most had forgotten. But for tonight, Damien was content to savor the memory of his son's laughter echoing through the empty store, a sound he'd waited 3 centuries to hear again. The Tuesday after the laughter incident, Maya arrived at work with an unusual flutter of anticipation in her chest. She'd spent the previous week replaying that moment of connection, wondering if Rainbow would return, or if somehow she'd imagined the significance of what had passed between them. At 2:47 a.m. exactly, the electronic door chime announced his arrival, and Maya felt relief wash through her as she watched him enter with his familiar measured pace. But tonight, something was different. Where his previous visits had followed the exact same pattern, tonight he paused at the entrance, those pale gray eyes scanning the store until they found her behind the counter. When their gazes met, he offered the smallest nod of recognition before continuing to aisle 2. Maya found herself holding her breath as she watched him approach the candy display, but instead of his usual 7-piece selection, he spent longer examining the options, occasionally glancing back toward her position. When he finally approached the counter, she saw he'd chosen 9 pieces this time, still in perfect chromatic order, but with additional selections that created a more complex pattern. As Maya began ringing up his purchases, she noticed something else different. Where the fluorescent lights usually buzzed at their standard harsh intensity, she'd unconsciously dimmed them slightly when she saw him enter, using the manual override switch she'd discovered during her first week. The softer lighting seemed to ease the tension she'd always noticed around his eyes, and his movements appeared more relaxed as he arranged his candy on the counter. Without conscious thought, Maya found herself creating an even more elaborate arrangement with his receipt and change, positioning each element to complement the expanded color pattern he'd presented. When Elijah saw her response to his more complex offering, his face brightened with that same delighted expression, though this time he contained his reaction to a small smile that nevertheless transformed his entire demeanor. Over the following weeks, their wordless ritual evolved into something approaching conversation. Elijah began visiting every other night instead of just Tuesdays, always arriving during the quietest hours when Maya could give him her full attention. She started preparing for his visits by ensuring his favorite candy varieties were perfectly stocked and arranged in the precise order he preferred. When she noticed him struggling with the harsh lighting, she developed a routine of adjusting the fluorescence to a softer setting whenever he entered. Maya also began leaving small gifts for him: receipt paper folded into geometric patterns, coin arrangements that created mathematical sequences, price tags configured into puzzles that required pattern recognition to solve. She'd place these offerings discreetly on the counter, watching from the corner of her eye as he discovered them and worked through their logic with obvious pleasure. Elijah's own contributions grew increasingly sophisticated. Where he'd initially left simple origami cranes, he now brought intricate paper sculptures, dragons with individually scaled wings, flowers with layers of precisely folded petals, geometric shapes that seemed to shift and transform depending on the viewing angle. Each creation was left carefully positioned on Maya's counter, always in a spot where the security cameras couldn't capture the full detail. Maya kept every single one, creating a small shrine of paper art on her apartment windowsill where they caught the morning light in beautiful patterns. Meanwhile, far beneath the city in the ancient chambers where vampire politics played out across centuries, the Council of Seven grew increasingly restless about the royal succession question. Lord Cassius Blackmore, whose own lineage stretched back nearly 2 millennia, had been questioning Damien's fitness to rule ever since Elijah's peculiarities became apparent in his youth. The council chamber, carved from living rock and lit by crystals that had burned with cold fire for 1,000 years, echoed with heated debate as the assembled lords discussed the future of their kind. Cassius stood before the obsidian table where the 7 most powerful vampires in the region held court, his silver hair gleaming in the crystalline light as he presented his case with practiced eloquence. For 3 centuries, he argued, they had waited for the heir apparent to demonstrate the qualities necessary for leadership: the ability to command through force of will, to inspire loyalty through charismatic presence, to navigate the complex verbal negotiations that vampire politics demanded. Instead, They had a prince who couldn't speak to his own subjects, who fled from social gatherings, who showed none of the dominant characteristics their kind respected. Cassius painted a picture of weakness that would invite challenges from rival vampire houses, of a ruler who couldn't protect their territory or maintain the delicate balance between vampire society and the human world. The other council members listened with expressions that ranged from thoughtful consideration to obvious agreement, and Damien felt the weight of centuries pressing down on his shoulders as he prepared his defense of his son. But how could he explain to these ancient predators that Elijah's silence masked a brilliant mind that saw patterns they missed, that his apparent weakness was actually a different kind of strength? How could he make them understand that leadership might take forms they'd never imagined, especially when he was still discovering those possibilities himself? The political pressure intensified with each passing month, and Damien found himself walking an increasingly narrow line between protecting his son and maintaining his own authority. The Vampire King's position depended on the Council's continued support, and if they lost confidence in his judgment regarding the succession, his own reign could be challenged. Meanwhile, his nightly surveillance of Elijah continued, and he watched with growing amazement as his son seemed to come alive during his interactions with the convenience store clerk. There was a lightness in Elijah's movements after these encounters, a spark of engagement with the world that Damien hadn't seen since his son was a young vampire, before the weight of royal expectations and social rejection had driven him into protective silence. 3 weeks into this new pattern of frequent visits, Maya experienced a night that changed everything. The store had been unusually busy for a Tuesday, with a steady stream of customers creating chaos that set her nerves on edge. When Elijah entered at his customary time, she was dealing with a particularly drunk college student who'd knocked over an entire display of energy drinks while arguing loudly on his phone. Maya was crouched behind the counter, frantically trying to clean up the spilled beverages, while the drunk customer continued his conversation, oblivious to the mess he'd created. She heard the electronic door chime, announcing another customer, but couldn't look up from the sticky puddle of energy drink that was rapidly spreading toward the electrical outlets behind the counter. Suddenly, the spreading liquid stopped moving, as if time itself had paused. Maya glanced up and froze, her breath catching in her throat as she witnessed something that defied every law of physics she understood. Elijah was moving faster than human vision should have been able to track, his form blurring as he repositioned the fallen display case, gathered the scattered cans, and somehow redirected the flow of spilled liquid away from the electrical hazards. The entire cleanup took less than 3 seconds, but Maya saw every impossible moment of it. When the motion stopped, Elijah stood perfectly still in the center of the aisle, his pale gray eyes now reflecting the security camera's infrared light with an unmistakably inhuman silver gleam. The drunk customer remained oblivious, still shouting into his phone as he stumbled toward the exit, completely unaware of what had just occurred. Maya and Elijah stared at each other across the distance of the store, the weight of revelation hanging between them like a physical presence. She watched terror flood across his features as he realized what she'd witnessed, his entire body tensing as if preparing to flee. Every detail she'd noticed about him over the past months suddenly clicked into place with crystalline clarity. His nocturnal schedule, his sun sensitivity, the otherworldly grace in his movements, the way he seemed to avoid touching metal surfaces, the pale perfection of his skin that never showed blemishes or variations in tone. Instead of fear, Maya felt the deep satisfaction that came from solving a complex puzzle, the pieces of Elijah's nature finally arranging themselves into a coherent picture that made perfect sense. Moving slowly and deliberately, she reached up and adjusted the security camera that had captured the infrared reflection, angling it away from where he stood. Then, keeping her voice barely above a whisper, she spoke the words that would bind them together in ways neither fully understood yet. "Your secret's safe," she said, her tone carrying all the sincerity and acceptance she could convey. The relief that washed over Elijah's features was so profound that Maya felt tears prick her own eyes in response. In the shadows outside Sullivan's Corner Market, Damien Ashworth witnessed this exchange with a mixture of admiration and growing dread. The young woman's reaction to discovering Elijah's true nature had been everything he could have hoped for. Instant understanding instead of fear, protection instead of exploitation, acceptance instead of rejection. But her knowledge also represented a danger that kept him awake during the daylight hours when vampires typically rested. If the council learned that a human knew about Elijah's nature and had formed a meaningful connection with him, they would see it as the ultimate proof of his unfitness to rule. Vampires were taught from birth that emotional attachments to mortals were weaknesses that could be exploited by enemies, vulnerabilities that no future king could afford. Yet if Damien eliminated this threat to protect his son's political position, he would destroy the first genuine happiness Elijah had experienced in 3 centuries. The woman represented both salvation and damnation, and Damien found himself caught between his duties as a king and his love as a father. As the weeks passed and he continued his surveillance, watching their wordless friendship deepen into something approaching trust, Damien began researching ancient vampire laws and precedents, searching for some legal framework that might protect them both when the inevitable political crisis arrived. In the deepest vaults beneath the vampire capital, where ancient scrolls and forgotten treaties lay preserved in crystalline cases that had kept them unchanged for millennia, Damien Ashworth spent his daylight hours searching through records that predated most civilizations. The archive of eternal laws stretched through caverns carved from living rock, its shelves extending into darkness that even vampire eyes struggled to penetrate. Each document here represented centuries of vampire jurisprudence, political precedents, and sacred laws that governed their kind across ages, when humans still believed the world was flat. Damien had been searching for 3 weeks, driven by desperation to find some legal framework that could protect both his son and the mortal woman who had somehow reached through centuries of silence to touch Elijah's isolated soul. The vampire king moved through the archives with methodical precision, his immortal patience allowing him to examine scrolls and codices that lesser beings would have abandoned as hopeless causes. Most of the legal precedents dealt with territorial disputes, blood rights, or the complex hierarchies that governed vampire society, but Damien persisted in his search, knowing that somewhere in this vast collection lay the answer to his impossible situation. As he worked his way through the oldest section of the archives, where documents written in languages that had died before Rome was founded crumbled at the slightest touch, Damien discovered a collection of scrolls bound in midnight blue silk that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. The binding was marked with symbols he recognized as belonging to the First Court, the legendary assembly of vampire lords who had established the fundamental laws of their kind when the world was young and magic flowed more freely through mortal realms. These scrolls contained the primordial codes, laws so ancient that most modern vampires had forgotten they existed, statutes that governed the deepest mysteries of vampire nature and the sacred bonds that could form between their kind and mortals. Damien handled these documents with reverent care, knowing that each page contained wisdom accumulated over thousands of years by vampires whose names had become legend. The archaic script was difficult to decipher, written in a form of the vampire tongue that had evolved significantly over the centuries. But Damien's royal education had included study of these ancient languages specifically to enable him to navigate such research. As he translated each passage, he began to understand that he was reading about connections between vampires and mortals that went far beyond the typical predator and prey relationships that defined most interactions between their species. The fourth scroll spoke of bonds that could form when vampire and mortal souls recognized each other across the barriers of mortality and undeath, connections that were so rare and precious that the First Court had created special laws to protect and govern them. The text described phenomena that made Damien's ancient heart race with recognition. Mortals who could sense vampire nature without fear. Vampires who found peace in the presence of specific humans. Connections that manifested in shared understanding of patterns and rhythms that others couldn't perceive. When Damien reached the section known as the resonance doctrine, he felt as if lightning had struck his immortal soul. The law was written in formal court language that had remained unchanged for over 2,000 years, but its meaning was crystal clear to anyone who understood the legal traditions of vampire society. If an heir to any vampire throne formed a true connection with a mortal being, evidenced by the restoration of speech to one who had lost the ability to communicate, the return of joy to one who had known only silence, or the manifestation of trust where fear had previously reigned, then that mortal was to be recognized as a bridge keeper, a sacred position that granted them protection under the most ancient and inviolable laws of vampire society. The bridge keeper was to be considered as belonging to the royal house, protected from harm by any vampire under penalty of facing the full wrath of the assembled courts, and granted extended life so that their bond with the heir could flourish without the normal constraints of mortal existence. In return, the bridge keeper became bound to the royal house forever, their fate intertwined with that of the vampire they had connected with. Their role expanded to include serving as an intermediary between vampire and human societies when such connections became necessary for the preservation of both kinds. Damien read the passage 3 times to ensure he understood every nuance of the ancient law, his excitement growing with each reading as he realized that the legal framework he needed had existed for millennia, waiting for circumstances that had finally aligned in his son's favor. The resonance doctrine had been invoked only 7 times in recorded vampire history, each instance becoming legendary among their kind, as examples of bonds that transcended the normal boundaries between vampire and mortal realms. The last recorded invocation had occurred over 1,000 years ago, when a vampire prince in the Eastern Territories had formed a connection with a mortal scholar that had ultimately led to a golden age of cooperation between vampires and the human magical communities of that era. The documentation showed that bridgekeeper bonds had historically resulted in periods of unprecedented prosperity and advancement for vampire society, as the unique perspectives brought by mortals had helped vampire leaders navigate challenges that pure vampire thinking couldn't resolve. The law also specified the ritual requirements for formally establishing a bridgekeeper bond, ceremonies that would need to be performed before the full vampire court to ensure legal recognition and protection. Damien felt hope surge through his immortal frame as he realized that not only did legal precedent exist for protecting Maya, but that vampire society had historically benefited enormously from such connections when they occurred naturally. The resonance doctrine would provide complete legal justification for Elijah's relationship with the mortal woman, transforming what the council currently viewed as a dangerous weakness into a sacred bond recognized by the oldest and most respected laws of their kind. However, as Damien continued reading, he discovered that invoking the resonance doctrine would require public acknowledgement of the bond before the assembled vampire court. Formal testimony regarding the manifestation of connection between heir and mortal, and most challenging of all, demonstration that the mortal in question possessed the specific qualities that made them suitable for the bridgekeeper role. The ancient texts specified that bridgekeepers must demonstrate wisdom, courage, loyalty, and the ability to maintain vampire secrets, even under extreme pressure. They must also show evidence of understanding vampire nature without losing their essential humanity, maintaining the balance that made them effective intermediaries between the two species. Damien realized that while the law provided the protection he sought, invoking it would thrust both Elijah and Maya into the center of vampire political attention at a time when the royal succession was already under intense scrutiny. The council would examine every aspect of their relationship, test Maya's suitability for the bridgekeeper role, and ultimately vote on whether to formally recognize the bond that had formed between them. Failure to gain council approval would result in Maya being classified as a security threat to vampire society, a designation that would require her elimination to protect their secrets. But success would not only protect her, but also provide unassailable legal justification for Elijah's eventual ascension to the throne, as bridgekeeper bonds were considered among the strongest possible indicators of a vampire's fitness to rule. The ancient texts made it clear that vampires capable of forming such connections possessed wisdom, emotional intelligence, and leadership qualities that traditional measures of royal fitness often missed. As Damien carefully returned the ancient scrolls to their protective cases, his mind raced with the implications of his discovery. The resonance doctrine offered a path forward that could transform his family's greatest vulnerability into their strongest asset. But it would require careful timing, strategic presentation to the council, and absolute faith in both his son's bond with Maya and her ability to prove herself worthy of the sacred trust that bridgekeeper status represented. He would need to prepare them both for scrutiny, unlike anything they had ever experienced, while simultaneously building political support among council members who could be convinced to see the ancient wisdom in laws their modern sensibilities might initially reject. The Vampire King emerged from the archives as dawn broke over the city above, his immortal features set with determination as he began planning the most crucial political campaign of his long reign, knowing that the future of both his son and their entire bloodline now depended on a convenience store clerk's ability to prove herself worthy of a sacred bond that hadn't been invoked for over 1,000 years. Lord Cassius Blackmore had survived nearly 2 millennia by trusting his instincts, and those instincts now screamed that something fundamental had shifted in the royal household's dynamics. From his obsidian tower overlooking the vampire district, he watched the patterns of power with the patience of a predator who understood that political victories were won through careful observation and strategic timing. For weeks, he had noticed subtle changes in King Damien's behavior during council meetings, a distraction that hadn't existed before, a defensive posture when discussing the succession question, and most tellingly, a confidence that suggested the Vampire King believed he held cards that others couldn't see. Cassius had built his political power on information, maintaining a network of spies and informants throughout vampire society that allowed him to anticipate threats before they materialized. When he sensed that Damien was hiding something significant, he activated resources that had been dormant for decades, calling in favors from vampires whose loyalty he had purchased with blood, gold, and carefully orchestrated political advantages. The surveillance began subtly, with watchers positioned at key points throughout the city to track the movements of the royal family and identify any unusual patterns in their behavior. Within days, Cassius's network had identified the convenience store as a location of particular interest, noting that Prince Elijah visited the establishment with suspicious regularity and always during the same shift hours. The reports described interactions between the prince and a mortal woman that seemed far more significant than simple commercial transactions, exchanges that suggested a level of familiarity and comfort that violated every protocol regarding vampire contact with humans. Cassius personally reviewed the surveillance reports with growing excitement, recognizing that he had stumbled upon exactly the kind of weakness that could destroy Damien's political position permanently. A vampire prince forming attachments to mortals represented the ultimate violation of their kind's fundamental principles, providing irrefutable evidence of unfitness to rule that even Damien's most loyal supporters couldn't defend. To gather more detailed intelligence, Cassius arranged for 2 of his most trusted agents to infiltrate the convenience store's operations, positioning them as new employees who could observe the interactions between prince and mortal without arousing suspicion. Jessica Morrison had been working part-time at Sullivan's Corner Market for 6 months when the strange customer first caught her attention. But it wasn't until she started paying closer attention to Maya's shift patterns that she began noticing the truly odd coincidences. The pale, quiet young man only appeared when Maya was working, never during Jessica's solo shifts or when other employees were on duty. His visits followed an almost mechanical schedule that seemed designed to maximize his interaction time with Maya while avoiding contact with anyone else. Jessica found his behavior unsettling in ways she couldn't articulate, noting how he moved through the store with an unnatural grace that made no sound, how he seemed to avoid touching metal surfaces, and how the security cameras frequently malfunctioned when he was present, creating gaps in the footage that their manager could never explain satisfactorily. When Jessica mentioned these observations to Maya, her coworker became defensive in a way that only increased Jessica's suspicions. Maya claimed not to notice anything unusual about the customer, insisting that he was simply shy and preferred shopping during quiet hours, but Jessica had watched enough interactions between them to recognize that something deeper was occurring. The way Maya's entire demeanor changed when the strange customer entered, how she instinctively adjusted lighting and positioning to accommodate his preferences, and most disturbing of all, the wordless communication that seemed to flow between them suggested a relationship that went far beyond casual customer service. Jessica began documenting these encounters in a journal, noting patterns and behaviors that might help her understand what was happening in her workplace after midnight. Meanwhile, Maya remained blissfully unaware of the surveillance closing around her, focused entirely on the evolving connection with the person she still thought of as Rainbow despite now knowing his supernatural nature. Their interactions had grown richer and more complex, following her discovery of his true identity, with Maya finding ways to communicate acceptance and understanding through gesture and arrangement that transcended the need for words. She had researched vampire mythology extensively, cross-referencing folklore with her observations of Elijah's behavior to better understand his needs and limitations. The knowledge only deepened her fascination with him as an individual, revealing layers of complexity that made their wordless friendship feel more precious than any verbal relationship she had ever experienced. On the night that changed everything, Sullivan's Corner Market experienced an unexpected influx of customers that shattered the usual tranquil atmosphere of the graveyard shift. A nearby bar had closed early due to a kitchen fire, disgorging dozens of drunk college students into the university district, where they scattered in search of late-night snacks and sobering coffee. The convenience store filled with loud, chaotic energy that set Maya's nerves immediately on edge, the fluorescent lights seeming harsher than usual as voices overlapped in conversations punctuated by laughter that felt aggressive rather than joyful. When Elijah entered at his customary time, Maya watched his face transform with distress as he encountered the sensory assault of unexpected crowd noise, bright lights, and unpredictable human movement. She saw him freeze just inside the doorway, his pale features tightening with the kind of overwhelm she recognized from her own experiences with sensory overload. Without hesitation, Maya abandoned her post behind the counter and moved quickly to create a barrier between Elijah and the chaos, guiding him toward the quieter space behind the register where she could control the immediate environment. She dimmed the harsh fluorescence, positioned herself to block the worst of the noise and visual stimulation, and began implementing the same grounding techniques that helped her manage her own panic attacks when social situations became too intense. Maya's voice was soft and steady as she talked him through breathing exercises, her hands moving in gentle, repetitive patterns that provided visual focus while she helped him regulate his overwhelmed nervous system. The drunk customers remained oblivious to the crisis unfolding behind the counter, too absorbed in their own conversations to notice that the store's usual quiet had been disrupted by something more serious than simple business. In that moment of profound care and understanding, when Maya's instinctive response to his distress demonstrated a level of empathy and acceptance that Elijah had never experienced from another soul, something fundamental shifted inside him. 3 centuries of enforced silence cracked like ice under spring sun, and words emerged from his throat in a voice rusty from disuse, but clear with emotion that had been building for longer than some civilizations had existed. "Thank you, Maya," he whispered, her name sounding like music in his ancient accent, each syllable carrying the weight of gratitude that spanned centuries of isolation and loneliness. The sound of his voice speaking her name sent shockwaves through Maya's consciousness, confirming what she had suspected but never dared hope, that their connection meant as much to him as it did to her, that the careful attention and understanding she had offered had reached across the vast gulf between their species to touch something essential in his isolated existence. But what Maya and Elijah couldn't know was that the moment his voice broke its centuries-long silence, magical resonances rippled outward through dimensions that mortals couldn't perceive, carrying the news of this unprecedented development to every vampire lord within 1,000 miles. The ancient magic that governed their kind recognized the significance of an heir's returned speech, understanding it as evidence that the bridgekeeper bond described in the oldest laws had finally manifested after more than a millennium of dormancy. In council chambers and private sanctuaries throughout the vampire realm, powerful beings felt the mystical pulse that announced Elijah's transformation, and each interpreted the development according to their own political interests and understanding of what it meant for the future of vampire society. Lord Cassius received the news of Elijah's spoken words with savage satisfaction, immediately recognizing the political opportunity that had just fallen into his hands. The prince's ability to speak to a mortal before demonstrating similar communication with his own people could be presented as ultimate proof of his misplaced priorities and fundamental unfitness for leadership. Cassius began drafting formal challenges to the succession that would force the issue before the full council, knowing that he now possessed evidence of weakness that even Damien's most loyal supporters would struggle to defend against accusations of compromised judgment and dangerous vulnerability to mortal influence. King Damien felt the magical resonance with a mixture of joy and dread, understanding immediately that his son's breakthrough meant their time for quiet preparation had ended and the political battle for Elijah's future was about to begin in earnest. The next morning, as Maya finished her shift in a daze of wonder and confusion about what Elijah's words meant for their impossible friendship, Damien made the decision that would change all their lives forever. He appeared outside Sullivan's Corner Market just as Maya emerged into the dawn light. His imposing figure materialized from shadows in a way that should have been terrifying, but somehow felt like an inevitable conclusion to recent strange events. Maya looked into eyes that shared Elijah's unusual pale gray color and knew immediately who stood before her, even as her rational mind struggled to process the reality of meeting the Vampire King himself. Damien's voice carried the authority of centuries as he explained the supernatural world that had been hidden from her awareness, the political forces now moving to destroy or control her connection with his son, and the impossible choice that lay before her. The Bridgekeeper bond would grant her protection under laws older than most human civilizations, extending her natural lifespan and binding her fate permanently to the royal house, but accepting it meant entering a world of vampire politics where mortals were typically viewed as pawns rather than partners. Refusing the bond would mean losing Elijah forever, as the council would never allow an unprotected mortal to maintain knowledge of vampire society, and the trauma of forced separation might drive his son back into the silence that had defined 3 centuries of his existence. As Damien spoke, Maya felt the weight of destiny settling around her shoulders like a cloak she had never asked to wear, but couldn't refuse without destroying the most meaningful connection she had ever experienced. The formal summons arrived at dawn, delivered by a raven whose eyes gleamed with unnatural intelligence and whose voice carried the weight of ancient authority as it spoke the ritual words that bound King Damien to appear before the Council of 7 within 3 nights to present his heir for judgment. The parchment bore 7 different seals, each representing one of the vampire lords who had ruled their territories for centuries, and the language was formal court speak that left no room for negotiation or delay. Lord Cassius had moved with political precision, leveraging the magical resonance of Elijah's returned speech to force a confrontation that would settle the succession question permanently. The charges were carefully crafted to exploit traditional vampire prejudices, unfitness for rule evidenced by inability to communicate with his own people, dangerous vulnerability to mortal influence that compromised vampire security, and lack of the dominant characteristics necessary to command respect from other vampire houses. Each accusation was designed to resonate with council members who valued strength above all other qualities, who saw leadership as requiring the ability to intimidate enemies and inspire fear in subjects who might otherwise challenge royal authority. Damien read the summons 3 times, understanding that Cassius had maneuvered them into a position where defeat would mean not only Elijah's removal from the succession, but also potential exile or death for any mortal who possessed knowledge of vampire society without formal protection. The cathedral where the council convened was itself a weapon in this political battle, designed over centuries to overwhelm and intimidate anyone who appeared before the assembled lords. Built from black stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, the massive chamber rose 7 stories into darkness that vampire eyes could barely penetrate, its acoustics engineered to amplify every whispered word, while creating echoes that could disorient anyone unfamiliar with the space. 7 thrones carved from obsidian dominated the far end of the cathedral, positioned on elevated platforms that required supplicants to crane their necks upward when addressing the council, a psychological manipulation that reinforced the power differential between rulers and ruled. The walls were covered with murals depicting vampire history in all its blood-soaked glory, images of conquest and dominance that served as constant reminders of what their kind valued most in their leaders. Damien knew that bringing Elijah into this environment would be like asking a flower to bloom in a hurricane, but the ancient laws left no alternative to facing the council's judgment. With only 2 nights to prepare, father and son worked with desperate intensity to develop strategies that might allow Elijah to survive the ordeal without retreating into the protective silence that had defined most of his existence. Maya proved invaluable in this preparation, her understanding of sensory processing issues providing insights that centuries of vampire thinking had never considered. She helped Elijah map the cathedral's architectural details, studying old blueprints to identify potential safe spaces where he could retreat if the sensory input became overwhelming. Together, they developed a system of subtle hand signals that would allow her to communicate support and grounding techniques even when formal protocol prevented direct interaction. Maya researched vampire court customs with the intensity of a scholar preparing for the most important examination of her life, understanding that a single breach of etiquette could provide Cassius with ammunition to use against them all. Elijah shared knowledge that had been drilled into him since childhood, but never before seemed relevant to his isolated existence. The complex hierarchies that governed vampire interaction, the coded language that allowed meaning to be conveyed through seemingly innocent phrases, the subtle power displays that determined status within their rigidly structured society. As they worked together, Maya began to understand the enormous courage required for Elijah to function in a world that had never made accommodation for his different way of processing reality, while he marveled at her ability to see solutions where he had only perceived insurmountable obstacles. Their bond deepened through shared purpose, each discovering that fighting to protect the other brought out strengths they hadn't known they possessed. The attack came without warning on the second night of their preparation, when Maya was closing the convenience store and Elijah was walking the few blocks from his father's estate to meet her for another planning session. Cassius had chosen his moment carefully, knowing that eliminating Maya before the council meeting would not only remove a political threat, but also likely drive Elijah back into traumatized silence that would make any defense of his fitness impossible. The assassins were vampire mercenaries from outside the local territory, killers with no loyalty to the royal house who could be disavowed if the attack was traced back to its source. They moved with inhuman speed through the empty store, smashing lights and displays to create chaos while hunting for the mortal woman whose connection to the prince had disrupted centuries of political stability. Maya heard the first crash from the storage room where she was completing inventory, and her enhanced pattern recognition immediately identified the sounds as deliberately destructive rather than accidental. She moved toward the emergency exit, but vampire speed gave the attackers advantages that human reflexes couldn't match, and within seconds, she found herself trapped between empty shelves with nowhere to run. The lead assassin advanced with predatory confidence, fangs extended and claws ready to end the threat she represented with brutal efficiency. Maya closed her eyes and thought of Elijah, hoping that somehow he would understand she had tried to protect their impossible connection even when it cost her everything. The sound that filled the store was unlike anything Maya had ever heard, a roar of fury that seemed to shake the building's foundation as Elijah arrived to find his sanctuary under attack and his bridgekeeper in mortal danger. What followed was a display of vampire combat prowess that revealed layers of Elijah's nature that even his father had never fully appreciated. Moving with lethal grace that made the assassins look clumsy by comparison, Elijah fought with a precision that spoke of centuries of training and an instinctive understanding of vampire weaknesses that came from royal bloodline breeding. His usual gentle demeanor vanished, replaced by something ancient and terrible that reminded Maya why vampires had been feared throughout human history. The battle lasted less than 3 minutes, ending with 2 assassins destroyed, and the third fleeing into the night to report back to his employer that the prince was far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. When Elijah turned back to Maya, his fangs still extended and his eyes blazing with protective fury, she saw him fully for the first time. Not just the isolated young man who found comfort in patterns and routine, but the vampire prince whose gentle nature masked predatory instincts that could be unleashed when those he cared about faced threats. Instead of fear, Maya felt a deep understanding that violence had been necessary to protect what they were building together, and her acceptance of this darker aspect of his nature strengthened their bond in ways that peaceful interaction never could have achieved. With Cassius's direct attack having failed, Damien realized that the only protection for Maya lay in formally invoking the resonance doctrine before the council meeting, binding her to the royal house through ceremonies that would make harming her equivalent to attacking the crown itself. The bridgekeeper ritual required preparation that consumed their remaining time before the council hearing, as ancient protocols demanded specific components and conditions that hadn't been assembled for over a millennium. The ceremony took place in the royal family's private chapel, a sacred space carved from living rock deep beneath Damien's estate, where crystals embedded in the walls provided light that had burned continuously since the chamber's creation. Maya wore robes of midnight blue silk that marked her as a candidate for the ancient bond, while Elijah stood at her side in ceremonial garments that proclaimed his royal status and his role in the connection being formalized. Damien conducted the ritual using words in the old tongue that predated most human languages, invoking powers that existed at the intersection of vampire magic and mortal will. The ceremony began with acknowledgement of the bond that had already formed naturally between prince and mortal, formally recognizing what their hearts had known from the moment Maya first mirrored Elijah's patterns with intuitive understanding. Sacred oils were applied to Maya's forehead, hands, and heart, each application accompanied by oaths that bound her fate to the royal house while granting her protections that few mortals had ever received. As the ritual progressed, Maya felt changes beginning in her consciousness, new awareness opening like flowers in her mind as the bridgekeeper bond took hold. Her connection to Elijah deepened beyond anything she had imagined possible, allowing her to sense his emotions and thoughts with clarity that was both exhilarating and overwhelming. The enhanced intuition that came with the binding made her aware of patterns and connections that had previously remained hidden, while immunity to vampire mental influence ensured that no other member of their kind could manipulate or control her thoughts. But perhaps most significant was the sense of belonging that filled her soul as the ritual concluded. the knowledge that she was no longer alone in the world, but permanently connected to beings who understood and valued what made her unique. When Damien spoke the final words that completed the binding, Maya felt ancient magic settle around her like armor that would protect her in the battles ahead, marking her as bridge keeper to the heir apparent with symbols that would be visible to any vampire who encountered her. The ritual's completion sent resonances throughout vampire society that formally announced the invoking of laws that most had considered purely historical, preparing the way for a council meeting that would now be forced to consider legal precedents that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. As dawn broke over the city above their underground sanctuary, Maya and Elijah faced each other as beings fundamentally changed by ancient magic, their bond now protected by laws older than civilization, but their greatest challenges still lying ahead in the cathedral, where 7 vampire lords would determine whether their connection represented salvation or doom for them all. The Cathedral of Shadows stretched into darkness that seemed to swallow light itself, its obsidian walls rising 7 stories above the ancient floor where countless vampire lords had faced judgment across millennia of history. Maya walked between Damien and Elijah toward the center of the vast chamber, her ceremonial robes of midnight blue silk marking her as bridge keeper to the heir apparent, a title that hadn't been worn for over 1,000 years and drew stares from every corner of the assembled court. The 7 thrones dominated the far end of the cathedral, carved from black stone that gleamed with internal fire, positioned on elevated platforms that forced supplicants to crane their necks upward when addressing the lords who would determine their fate. Each throne held a vampire whose age could be measured in millennia, beings whose accumulated power made the air itself feel heavy with ancient authority and barely contained violence. Lord Valerius the Ancient occupied the central throne, his pale features bearing the timeless perfection of one who had ruled vampire territories since before Rome fell, his silver hair flowing like liquid metal over robes that seemed woven from shadow itself. To his right sat Lady Morgana Blackthorn, whose reputation for political cunning had survived 20 centuries of court intrigue, her emerald eyes fixed on Maya with an expression that mixed curiosity with calculation. Lord Cassius held the third throne, his satisfaction barely contained as he prepared to present his case against the royal succession, while the remaining council members observed with expressions ranging from mild interest to obvious skepticism regarding the unprecedented situation unfolding before them. Maya felt the weight of their collective gaze pressing down on her consciousness like a physical force, but the Bridgekeeper bond provided stability that allowed her to maintain composure even when faced with predators whose very presence should have triggered every survival instinct she possessed. The enhanced awareness that came with the ritual binding made her conscious of patterns and tensions in the assembled court that would have remained invisible to normal human perception, revealing the complex web of alliances and rivalries that governed vampire politics at its highest levels. Elijah stood at her side with rigid control that she recognized as his response to overwhelming sensory input, the cathedral's acoustics and visual chaos creating exactly the kind of environment that would normally drive him into protective silence. But Maya could feel his determination through their strengthened connection, understanding that he had chosen to endure this ordeal not for his own sake, but to protect their bond and the future they were trying to build together. King Damien positioned himself slightly forward of his son and Bridgekeeper, his royal bearing commanding attention as he prepared to invoke ancient laws that most of the council had never expected to see used in their lifetimes. When Lord Valerius spoke the ritual words that opened the formal hearing, his voice carried the authority of ages across the cathedral's stone expanse, reverberating through air that had witnessed the rise and fall of vampire dynasties throughout recorded history. The charges against Prince Elijah were presented with legal precision that revealed careful preparation and political calculation, each accusation designed to exploit traditional vampire values while undermining the legitimacy of the royal succession. Lord Cassius rose from his throne to address the assembled council, his silver tongue weaving arguments that had been refined through centuries of court experience and strategic thinking. He spoke of the fundamental requirements for vampire leadership, emphasizing the need for rulers who could command through force of personality, who could inspire fear in enemies and loyalty in subjects through demonstrations of dominance that left no room for question or challenge. The prince's 3 centuries of silence were presented as evidence of profound weakness, an inability to communicate with his own people that made effective leadership impossible in a society where verbal dominance determined political hierarchy. Cassius painted a picture of dangerous vulnerability in the royal house's attachment to mortal concerns, arguing that emotional connections to humans represented exploitable weaknesses that rival vampire factions could use to manipulate or destroy the crown's authority. The mortal woman's presence in their sacred chamber was characterized as an unprecedented breach of security that demonstrated the prince's unfitness to protect vampire interests, while her influence over him suggested compromised judgment that could lead to catastrophic decisions affecting their entire civilization. When Cassius concluded his presentation, the cathedral fell silent, except for the subtle sounds of ancient stone settling and crystal formations humming with barely audible energy that had sustained the chamber's illumination across centuries of use. According to the laws that govern such proceedings, Prince Elijah now faced the choice between defending his claim through combat against his accuser, or demonstrating leadership qualities worthy of the throne through direct address to the assembled council. Combat would have been the traditional choice, a test of physical prowess and vampire dominance that most heirs would have accepted without hesitation, but Maya felt Elijah's decision forming through their mental connection before he announced it to the court. When he stepped forward to address the 7 lords directly, speaking in a voice that carried clearly despite centuries of disuse, the assembled vampires reacted with surprise that bordered on shock. For 300 years, they had grown accustomed to the silent prince who attended ceremonies but never participated, and hearing him speak with confidence and clarity challenged assumptions that had become accepted facts in vampire political circles. Elijah began by acknowledging the traditional values that his accusers had cited, recognizing the importance of strength and leadership in vampire society, while questioning whether those qualities could only manifest in forms that had been recognized for millennia past. He spoke about leadership through understanding rather than intimidation, protection through building connections rather than inspiring fear, and the possibility that true strength might come from seeing patterns and possibilities that others missed rather than simply overpowering all opposition through brute force. His words carried weight that surprised even Maya, revealing depths of political insight and philosophical thinking that his silence had hidden from the world, understanding gained through centuries of observation and reflection that traditional vampire education couldn't provide. As Elijah continued speaking, Maya felt his confidence growing through their bond, her steady presence providing the emotional support that allowed him to access abilities he had always possessed but never been able to demonstrate in social situations that overwhelmed his different neurological wiring. He explained how his autism wasn't a weakness, but a different way of processing information that revealed patterns others couldn't see, connections that traditional vampire thinking might overlook because they required sustained attention to subtle details that dominant personalities often dismissed as irrelevant. The cathedral's acoustics carried his voice to every corner of the vast chamber, and Maya watched the assembled lords beginning to listen with genuine attention rather than mere political obligation, their ancient minds recognizing wisdom that transcended their expectations about what royal fitness should look like. When Elijah revealed his discovery of the growing hunter organization that threatened their entire civilization, the political dynamic in the cathedral shifted dramatically as council members realized they were hearing information that could determine vampire society's survival or destruction. For decades, he explained, his pattern recognition abilities had allowed him to track subtle changes in human behavior, technology development, and organizational structures that suggested coordinated preparation for large-scale vampire hunting operations. His silence hadn't been weakness or social inadequacy, but strategic observation, gathering intelligence through careful monitoring of human activities while avoiding the kind of direct engagement that might have revealed vampire interest in their preparations. The Hunter organization had been developing weapons specifically designed to neutralize vampire advantages, studying weaknesses that most vampires didn't even realize they possessed, and building networks that could coordinate attacks across multiple territories simultaneously. Traditional vampire lords had missed these developing threats because they focused on obvious challenges rather than subtle patterns, their dominance-oriented thinking making them overlook dangers that didn't announce themselves through direct confrontation. Elijah presented evidence that he had collected through years of careful research, connecting seemingly unrelated incidents into a comprehensive picture of organized opposition that was far more sophisticated and dangerous than anything vampire society had faced in centuries. His analysis revealed how the hunters had studied vampire behavioral patterns, identifying predictable responses and territorial habits that could be exploited to eliminate key figures and destabilize entire regions through precisely targeted strikes. The council listened with growing alarm as they realized that their traditional approaches to security had been completely inadequate to address threats that required the kind of systematic pattern analysis that Elijah's neurodivergent perspective made possible. When he concluded by explaining how his connection to Maya had enhanced rather than compromised his ability to understand and protect vampire interests, providing access to human insights that could help their kind adapt to changing circumstances, the cathedral fell into contemplative silence that stretched for long minutes. Lord Valerius exchanged meaningful glances with his fellow council members, their ancient minds processing implications that challenged fundamental assumptions about leadership, strength, and the requirements for royal succession in an era when traditional vampire thinking might prove insufficient for survival itself. Maya felt the political tide turning through her enhanced awareness, understanding that Elijah had transformed what began as a trial of his fitness into a demonstration of capabilities that the council hadn't known they needed, but now recognized as essential for navigating the challenges that lay ahead for their civilization. The silence that filled the Cathedral of Shadows stretched for what felt like eternity, before Lord Valerius spoke the ancient words that would begin the formal voting process, his voice carrying across stone that had witnessed the rise and fall of vampire dynasties throughout recorded history. Each council member would cast their vote according to traditions older than most human civilizations, speaking their decision aloud before the assembled court, so that no doubt could remain about the succession question that had divided vampire society for centuries. Lady Morgana Blackthorn was first to speak, her emerald eyes fixed on Elijah as she declared her recognition of his fitness to inherit the throne, citing his demonstration of intelligence-gathering capabilities that traditional vampire methods had failed to achieve. Lord Thornwick followed with his support, acknowledging that the prince's unique perspective had revealed threats that conventional thinking had missed entirely, while Lady Ravenna cast her vote based on the strength of the Bridgekeeper bond and its historical significance for vampire leadership. One by one, the ancient lords voiced their decisions until 6 of the 7 had confirmed Elijah as rightful heir apparent, their collective judgment recognizing that the challenges facing vampire society required exactly the kind of innovative thinking that his neurodivergent mind could provide. Lord Cassius cast the only dissenting vote, his silver tongue weaving final arguments about tradition and proven leadership methods. But his political isolation was complete, as the other council members aligned themselves with the new vision of vampire royalty that Elijah and Maya represented. When the formal tally was announced, Maya felt relief flood through her consciousness via the Bridgekeeper bond, sharing Elijah's overwhelming gratitude and wonder at having been accepted by the very society that had rejected him for 3 centuries. Damien's ancient features showed emotion that he rarely allowed himself to express publicly. Pride in his son mixing with satisfaction that their bloodline would continue and their people would benefit from leadership that understood both strength and compassion. Cassius accepted defeat with the grace of a political veteran who understood that battles could be lost while wars continued. His retreat from the cathedral carrying implications that suggested future challenges, rather than permanent surrender to the new order. The weeks following the council's decision brought changes that rippled throughout vampire society as news of the confirmed succession spread to territories around the world, carrying with it stories of the Bridgekeeper Bond and the prince whose silence had hidden extraordinary capabilities. Maya found herself thrust into a role she had never imagined, serving as intermediary between vampire and human concerns while learning to navigate political complexities that made convenience store management seem laughably simple by comparison. Elijah blossomed in ways that amazed everyone who had known him during his centuries of isolation, his confidence growing as he discovered that his differences were valued rather than merely tolerated, that his unique perspective could contribute meaningfully to the ancient institution he would someday lead. The Bridgekeeper Bond proved its worth repeatedly as Maya's intuitive understanding of human nature complemented Elijah's pattern recognition abilities, creating a partnership that enhanced both their individual strengths and generated insights neither could have achieved alone. 6 months after the cathedral confrontation, Maya stood in the renovated basement space beneath Sullivan's Corner Market, surveying the supernatural consulting business that had grown from their shared recognition that vampire and human communities faced interconnected challenges requiring collaborative solutions. The convenience store continued operating above them, maintained as both cover and reminder of where their partnership had begun, while the basement had been transformed into offices equipped to handle cases that bridged the supernatural and mundane worlds. Ancient vampire artifacts shared shelf space with modern technology, creating an environment that reflected the integration of old wisdom and new approaches that defined their working philosophy. Elijah moved through the space with easy confidence, his voice carrying clearly as he discussed their latest cases with visiting clients who represented the full spectrum of supernatural beings seeking assistance with problems that traditional authorities couldn't address. Maya watched him interact with a delegation of werewolf pack leaders, noting how his gentle demeanor and genuine interest in understanding their territorial disputes created trust that more aggressive vampire diplomacy had failed to establish. Their case files covered everything from interspecies boundary conflicts to supernatural beings struggling to integrate with human society, each situation requiring the kind of nuanced thinking that combined Maya's empathetic understanding of individual needs with Elijah's ability to see systemic patterns that others missed. The business had grown beyond their wildest expectations, drawing clients from supernatural communities throughout the region who had heard about the vampire prince and his bridgekeeper partner who could solve problems that had seemed intractable for decades or centuries. Maya's enhanced intuition allowed her to identify the emotional and social factors underlying conflicts that appeared to be purely territorial or resource-based, while Elijah's pattern recognition revealed connections between seemingly unrelated incidents that pointed toward comprehensive solutions rather than temporary fixes. Their success had attracted attention from both supporters and opponents, creating new political dynamics that required constant vigilance and strategic thinking to navigate safely. As evening approached and their last clients departed, Maya and Elijah found themselves back at the convenience store counter where their partnership had begun, surrounded by case files and supernatural artifacts rather than candy arrangements, but maintaining the same collaborative approach that had first brought them together. The familiar fluorescent lights hummed overhead, their harsh glare softened by filters that accommodated Elijah's sensory needs while providing adequate illumination for their detailed work. Maya spread out photographs and documents related to their most challenging current case. A series of mysterious disappearances that seemed to follow a specific pattern but defied conventional explanation from either human or vampire investigative methods. Elijah studied the materials with the same focused attention he had once devoted to arranging candy purchases. His enhanced analytical abilities now directed toward protecting beings from multiple species rather than simply finding comfort in routine and order. As they worked together, Maya realized that their initial connection over shared appreciation for patterns and structure had evolved into something far more significant than either had imagined possible during those first wordless encounters in the quiet hours after midnight. They had become partners in the truest sense, each bringing unique capabilities to challenges that required both human empathy and vampire wisdom, both intuitive understanding and systematic analysis. Their love had grown naturally from mutual respect and shared purpose, creating a bond that strengthened their professional effectiveness while providing the emotional foundation that allowed both to thrive in roles they had never expected to occupy. Elijah spoke easily now, his voice carrying confidence earned through months of successful problem solving and growing recognition within supernatural communities that had once viewed him as inadequate for leadership responsibilities. Maya had discovered strengths within herself that convenience store work had never revealed, finding that her neurodivergent perspective provided exactly the kind of innovative thinking that supernatural consulting required when traditional approaches failed to address complex interspecies issues. As they analyzed patterns in the disappearance cases, Maya felt the familiar satisfaction of puzzle pieces clicking into place, enhanced now by the bridge-keeper bond that allowed her to share insights directly with Elijah's consciousness and benefit from his immediate analytical response to her observations. The real adventure, she realized, lay not in their individual transformation, but in their ongoing mission to build bridges between worlds that had remained separate for millennia, creating new possibilities for cooperation and understanding that could benefit all the species they served. 1 year later, Maya stood before a joint assembly that included both vampire lords and human supernatural allies, her subtle bridgekeeper markings visible to those who knew how to recognize them, while her confident bearing demonstrated how completely she had grown into her role as intermediary between different communities. Elijah addressed the mixed audience with eloquence that would have seemed impossible during his centuries of silence, presenting proposals for interspecies cooperation agreements that built on the success of their consulting business and pointed toward a future where supernatural beings could work together rather than maintaining ancient divisions that served no one's interests. Their partnership had created ripple effects throughout supernatural society, inspiring other vampires to reconsider their relationships with different species while encouraging human magical communities to view vampires as potential allies rather than inevitable enemies. The consulting business had expanded into a full alliance-building organization that facilitated communication between groups that had been isolated from each other for centuries, creating networks of cooperation that strengthened everyone involved while generating new approaches to challenges that affected multiple species simultaneously. But success had also created new enemies among those who preferred traditional separation and conflict, requiring constant vigilance and strategic planning to protect the fragile connections they had worked so hard to establish. As Maya and Elijah concluded their presentation to the Joint Assembly, receiving enthusiastic support for their latest initiatives, Maya reflected on how their story had begun with two neurodivergent minds recognizing kindred spirits across species barriers and had evolved into a mission to reshape the supernatural world itself through patient pattern building that honored both difference and connection. The convenience store counter, where they had first found each other, remained their favorite workspace, a reminder that the most profound transformations often began with small acts of recognition and acceptance, patterns of understanding that could grow into movements capable of changing everything for the better, one perfect arrangement at a time.